Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast, equipping you to live redefined, renewed, and restored. I'm your host, Julie Rebboah. Let's tackle this week's topic.
When that happens, the best thing that could happen to an abuser is run out of people to abuse, because it's not healthy for an abuser to be an abuser. That is not a good life for them. And so it is not mean to help someone toward a better life. You can't necessarily change them, but if they run out of people to abuse, best thing that could happen to them. And so setting boundaries is not a mean thing. It's not an attack on people. It is holding to who you are. You don't have to be mean about it as you're leaving or anything of that nature, but it is just being faithful and truthful to who you are as a person and what you're willing to deal with. In some ways, I might be able to make the argument you're being more manipulative or more mean by enabling behavior that is clearly not healthy for that person or within that family.
Hey friends, before we dive into this awesome episode, I have a question for you. Did you know that faith is a powerful tool to improve your well-being and help you overcome childhood traumas such as abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction? Based on some research I did, it's true. And I know you'll want access to this little discussed, yet highly empowering information. So I created a free video called 3 Powerful Ways That Faith Increases Your Well-Being After Childhood Trauma. I not only explain how Christians have a faith advantage, but how you can harness the transformative power of God in your healing journey. It's free and available for download now. Just click the link in the show notes to free gift or use the QR code shown on YouTube to get your copy now. Welcome to another episode of the Room to Bloom podcast. This week we have a returning guest, Dr. Mark A. Hicks, and we're discussing how you can have a happier holiday season by using boundaries. And so today's conversation, we're going to talk about managing expectations during the holidays, what boundaries are, how they're biblical, and what you can do if and when they get challenged. So let's get started. Welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. So please tell us a little bit about yourself for listeners who didn't hear your previous episode on learning to love.
I am an author, speaker, a relationship specialist. I wrote the book, Learning Love, Building a Life That Matters and Healthy Relationships That Last. And I originally published that book. It was a self-published book on Amazon, but that particular version is no longer available because I'm glad to say it has just been picked up by Morgan James Publishing. Yay. And so it will be coming out in June of 25. The pre-orders will be available soon. And in the meantime, I do have a free ebook available on my website about the 5 components of love that I teach in the book. And basically, I specialize in love and relationships because that affects every area of our life. It affects us at home. It affects us at work. Obviously, the relationships we have at home are different than those we have at work or at church or in other places. But the principles of building healthy relationships are the same. And as we get into the holidays and we're dealing with all the things that come with that, the principles of building healthy relationships still the same.
That's so true. So congratulations on your book being picked up by the Morgan James Publishing Company. That's an incredible accomplishment. And I'm so glad that you're here to help us with the holidays because so many of us want the holiday season. So I'm talking about Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year. We want a Hallmark holiday. Yes. And oftentimes in the past, if we haven't had a Hallmark holiday, we want this year especially to be something like we see, but often that's not the case. So how can we manage our expectations even before we go into the holiday season?
Yeah, it's important to be realistic. The Hallmark holiday, it just doesn't exist. There might be a few exceptions. There might be a couple of listeners that said, hey, wait a minute, I really experienced that. And I would not contradict that. But on a wide scale, it just doesn't exist. There's a reason why they play those movies on the Hallmark Channel. It's entertaining. It's fun. It's what people might aspire to, and it's okay to want that, and it's okay to strive toward it. But striving towards something is different than expecting it. We can try, we can emulate certain things to try to get as close as we can to that picturesque, beautiful thing, but it generally is going to fall short of that, and that's okay. That's the idea behind expectations. It is okay to not reach that particular level because the fact is, everyone's struggling. Sometimes we think it's just us, that we see those pictures on social media of the beautiful family scene, and we see people all excited to go to their parents' house for Thanksgiving or Christmas and all the great parties coming up. And those are great, but people tend to put their highlight film on social media. It's not necessarily always 100% accurate, but we need to understand that everyone's struggling. Every family has its difficulties. If you can have a basically good holiday season, enjoy it. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, such great advice. If it's never been perfect, it probably won't be in the future.
Right.
And we can always try to improve our holidays, but not to have the expectation that it will be different than maybe the years before. But despite that, it's possible to create good memories, even though we may still have the uncle who always tells bad jokes, the relative who won't stop talking about hot topics like maybe politics or whatnot,
Mhm.
or family members who disregard feelings or overlook people's special dietary needs and cause offenses. So, what can we do to overcome some of those annoying behaviors that are often present when we have a large gathering?
And that is so true. Everyone has that aunt or that uncle or cousin that you generally try to avoid, but during the holiday season, it's harder to do that. And I often say that if you think you don't have that person in your family, you're probably it, because it's just almost universal that someone is going to push the envelope. Some people enjoy that. We sort of have to remember that some people go in with an agenda. They like stirring things up. Some people have that personality. They like just gouging people and seeing if they could get an argument started or irritate people. That's for some reason, there are people that enjoy that. That's their version of humor. I think the key to it going in is know where your line is. We do have to put up with family. We have to put up with them, even if they're annoying and even if they do things that are offensive. There are things, if we're going to be around our families, we have to have a certain level of patience and a certain level of just putting up with stuff. We don't have to like it, but we just put up with it for the sake of keeping the peace during the holidays. But know where your line is and be very clear on that in your mind, because abuse is not allowed and toxic behavior is just not allowed. And that's somewhat difficult to define. It can be in the eye of the beholder. There are some jokes that are annoying, maybe mildly offensive, that we could roll our eyes and just go on and let it go. There are some things that we just can't let go, and we need to know what that is and be clear in our mind what we're going to put up with, what we're not going to, and how we're going to handle that if someone does cross the line, of how we're going to go about confronting that or saying that's too much. That's going too far. I can't stand for that. And so if we're just sort of winging it, we're more likely to put up with things that we regret later and think we should have taken a stand against that, or we're liable to lose our temper more quickly because something just strikes us the wrong way and it just sets us off. And if someone does cross the line, know where that line is and have a basic plan on what you're going to do.
So, how can someone determine what their boundaries are if maybe that's a process they haven't really gone through or thought through before?
Yeah, it's somewhat, like I say, in the eye of the beholder. Everyone has a different place, but it's important to understand that boundaries are not picking a fight. or kicking somebody out of your life, or it's not mean to set a boundary. It's not harsh or hateful to set a boundary. It is being true to who you are and to your principles and to who you are as a person. And so boundaries are really an idea of this is where I live my life. This is how I'm going to conduct myself. And this is what I'm going to let into my sphere, into my realm, into who I am. And understanding that allows us to say that if someone is violating that, we're not going to be mean to them. We don't have to attack them. We don't have to hate them. But that person is choosing not to be around us anymore. They may not think they're choosing that, but that's what they're choosing. If they are choosing to act outside of who we are and how we're going to conduct ourselves, then they are the ones making that choice. They're the ones choosing to leave. And so knowing what a boundary is helps to begin to set it. Because so many times we begin to think, well, I can't set a boundary because that would be mean, especially in the holidays. It's simply knowing that it is a healthy thing. It is not something that's mean or hateful. It is not throwing people out of your life or being cruel to them. And it's not even necessarily correcting them, because some people are going to listen, some are not. But it is what you are going to live with. And everyone has a right to set that. We have a right to be in a realm, in an area of life that we're willing to live. And again, we have to put up with some things. If you set that boundary too strictly, you're going to be alone in life. You're never going to be able to have people around you because people are going to make mistakes. But too generously, you're going to lose who you are. You're not going to be a person of principle. And so beginning to just understand what a boundary is, it begins to become more in focus. That I get to say, this is where I live my life. For example, this is an easy one, but physical violence just isn't allowed. We are not going to allow it. People might get upset. They might say things. We might be willing to put up with that. But if physical violence begins at a family gathering, we have to leave. We cannot stand for that. We cannot be in that realm. And I hope no one would choose to say that's okay. It's just not. And so understanding that says, if someone is going to act violently, then we don't have a relationship. And that's their choice because they're choosing to act in that way.
Yeah, some of the boundaries that come to mind for me might be financial. What are the expectations around Christmas gifts, for example,
Right.
for the kids, for parents, and how much do we want to spend? That might be a boundary.
Right.
Or maybe expectations and rules surrounding what gets posted on social media regarding the children involved, or alcohol or drugs that might be present at the family gathering. Right. Are there any others that you could think of that might be a common thing people need to think through?
Yeah, it can be politics. It can be certain brands of humor that we're just not comfortable with, especially if children are going to be around. And it's important to be upfront about that and to discuss that beforehand. If we surprise people with it, we're probably not going to get a good result. If we sort of know someone has a tendency to violate this boundary year after year, and we go in ready to confront them when they do it, that's not a great plan. Talk about it openly. Be real clear about what your boundaries are, and then you might even be able to negotiate a little bit. There might be some measure of gray area. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast line. If someone, to use your example about Christmas gifts, if you have a limit and someone wants you to go $5-10 above that, maybe that's something you could do. That's something that could be discussed. When someone wants to go $500 over that, no, that's not up for discussion. And so being clear about it up front is a much better plan, even though it may be uncomfortable, than waiting until the moment that something happens.
Yeah, that's great advice. Just being upfront and having a respectful but calm discussion about
Yeah.
some of the things that have been an issue in the past before the holidays begin. And so, but there is a difference between setting a boundary and upholding a boundary.
Mhm.
And so, could you talk a little bit about that? Because sometimes we have the best intentions, like, well, I'm not going to tolerate that this year, but then sometimes we don't follow through.
Exactly. Yes, it's important to have a plan. Now, the best laid plans are going to get altered in the moment sometimes, and that's okay. But have a plan going in. Know when you're going to leave the room. Know when you're going to leave the house. Know when you're leaving that party. That you pack up and go. Understand that there are lines that you don't cross, and if people are going to violate that, yes, it's going to ruin everyone's holiday, and that's unfortunate. But if you've been clear up front and say, I cannot tolerate this. This is not how we're going to do things, or not going to be a part of it, then have a plan of where that line is and when you're going to leave. But again, it's important to be clear about that up front. If we make that into a drama, we storm out and everybody wonders why. That's not the best way to handle it, and it doesn't usually lead to any good result. And also be clear about if you're going to even be there. Because if something has happened year after year, to think it's not going to this year is probably just dreaming. It's going to happen again this year. If that's your family pattern, it's going to happen. If you want that to change, you have to confront that before you get there. You can't walk in the door and say, all right, folks, this year we're not doing that this time. That won't work because everyone's in that mode. If you want something to change, confront it before you get there. But be clear on when you're leaving. Be clear on where that line is and when you're going to remove yourself from that situation. And again, this is their choice. If you've made it clear, you're not being mean to them. They have made the choice because you've been clear, I'm not staying if this starts. And if it starts, you're just simply following through on what you said, and that was their choice to have that happen.
So that brings up two questions that I have. So, one, it sounds like you need to be prepared to leave the room, leave the situation, or maybe even leave the home, which would mean that you need a place to be able to leave to
Yes.
and a way to get there. And so, for some people, that might include having their own transportation, maybe having a hotel room, things like that. And then, second, the thought that comes to my mind that probably many listeners are wondering is, that seems so mean. As a Christian, how can I set these boundaries and then leave the situation or leave the house? How is that a Christian thing to do? How is that biblical?
Again, if you've prepared up front, if you've been clear up front, nobody says you have to storm out. You don't have to cause a big scene. You certainly don't need to throw things or be violent in your leaving or anything of that nature. But if you have set that boundary up front and said, this is when I'm leaving, then it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It will be. They'll act like it's a huge shock. But you have been clear about that, and you can simply calmly leave. It doesn't have to be mean. And one of the things that I think we have to understand about all of this with boundaries, especially if we're talking about abusive behavior, and that's when we would really leave, is that the behavior has become abusive. When that happens, the best thing that could happen to an abuser is run out of people to abuse. Because it's not healthy for an abuser to be an abuser. That is not a good life for them. And so it is not mean to help someone toward a better life. You can't necessarily change them, but if they run out of people to abuse, best thing that could happen to them. And so setting boundaries is not a mean thing. It's not an attack on people. It is holding to who you are. You don't have to be mean about it as you're leaving or anything of that nature, but it is just being faithful and truthful to who you are as a person and what you're willing to deal with. In some ways, I might be able to make the argument you're being more manipulative or more mean by enabling behavior that is clearly not healthy for that person or within that family. It's difficult, but it's not mean. And so drawing a distinction there, just because it's difficult, and it certainly is. When we're talking about family particularly, it's just so difficult to do. So I don't want to minimize that. But because it's difficult doesn't mean you did something wrong. And that's where we sometimes get tripped up because it feels so hurtful. It feels so difficult to do. And it's something we don't want to do. And we so wish it could be different. Then we start assuming it must be wrong. Well, difficult things sometimes are right. Yeah, they're just difficult. In fact, some of the most difficult things are the right thing to do. And so being able to distinguish, yes, this hurts, and yes, it feels terrible, but that doesn't make it wrong.
I'm so glad that you made the distinction that setting and upholding boundaries is not the same thing as being mean or unforgiving.
Right.
And actually, it might be a good thing to hold that person respectfully accountable
Yeah.
so that we aren't enabling them anymore. And that might be the first time somebody has heard that viewpoint, because I think oftentimes as Christians, we can get really confused between forgiveness and enabling, where we're continuing
Yeah.
to let bad patterns repeat over and over and over again.
It's so easy to get that confused and to become an enabler, to become codependent, which means that we are sort of addicted to helping people and addicted to helping them the way they want help. And so it begins to feel good to give them what they want, even though it may be bad for them. And so by enabling this kind of behavior, we may be able to tell ourselves we're just being patient, we're being loving, we're being kind. But what we are really doing is enabling them to live a terribly destructive life and to continue to bring that influence on other people in the family, particularly children. And so again, it may sound trivial, but it's not to say that the best thing that could happen to an abuser is to run out of people to abuse. That may sound idealistic, but if enough people understand boundaries, abusers will have no choice but to start rethinking how they're doing things.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, what also comes to mind is that I can imagine that there would be other family members once you set a boundary and you're preparing to leave, like, okay, let's grab our stuff, have a great night everybody, we're going to take off now, that other family members who have been engaging in this family dynamic for years and years might start laying guilt trips on you to don't ruin the family holiday, you're being too sensitive, just forgive and let's move on. How can people handle these common things that occur when we do start setting and upholding those boundaries?
Yeah, that's almost guaranteed. You will very rarely hear from the perpetrator, from the one that is the abuser or the source of the toxicity within the family. That's not normally going to happen. It could, but you're probably going to hear from your sister or your cousin or someone else in the family that is triangulated in to put that guilt trip on you and to say, why can't we just get along? Why, that's just who they are. And one of the things that always intrigued me, that will be the argument of, well, that's just how they are. Well, how about how I am? Why don't I, why is it they get to set who they are and we don't? That makes no sense. Who made that rule? That the perpetrator and the abuser gets to just be who they are and that's just them. Well, we get to say, this is just me. And I don't allow my kids to be subject to that kind of language or whatever that is. And it's difficult to give examples because there's so many ways that this could go. So you really have to just know your own family. But when we start setting that boundaries, we're saying the same thing. This is who I am. And we all have a right to do that. See, when we set a boundary, we're not trying to change the perpetrator. We're not saying when your family member comes to you and says, well, that's just who they are. I'm not trying to change them. They can be who they are. They can continue to end that as much as they want, but they can't continue that with me there. And I have the right to say that. And so we're not trying to change them, and no one has the right to change us. We can discuss, and if we're a good person, of course, we're going to try to be as patient as we can. Again, if you set a boundary too tight, if you're too strict with it, you're going to end up being alone. You're never going to have a relationship. And so this is not to try to impose your way on other folks. It is understanding they get to be who they are, but when that begins to cross over into who you are and violating who you are, your principles, your values, you have as much right to say this is who I am as they have a right to say that's who they are. But more directly to your question, we're going back to, you have to be prepared. That person who's going to be triangulated in should not be surprised that you left. Again, they'll probably act like it, but they need to know up front. And so understand your family dynamics. Understand that perpetrator is probably not going to be the one to call. It's probably going to be the peacemaker in your family, and everybody's got one. It's going to be that peacemaker. They're going to mean well. They're being true to what they believe is right, and that's okay. But you still have the right to say, this is what I value. This is who I am. And I'm only going to be in places where I'm allowed to be that.
So it sounds like, in preparing for the holidays, it's important to know what our boundaries are, and then be prepared to respond if and when those boundaries are crossed. And so, do you think it would be helpful if people rehearsed some scripts for some things that they've commonly faced and know that are going to be an issue for them going into the holidays?
Absolutely. In fact, I would go a step further and say, go to a counselor. I always say everyone needs to be in counseling because life is just difficult. And again, this is not just your family. You're not going to go to that counselor and say, my family just falls into the abyss every Christmas and everyone ends up arguing. You will never find a counselor and be like, well, I've never heard that before. Every counselor has heard that because so many families struggle with this. And so if you know this is coming and you're trying to figure out where can I compromise, where can I show patience, but where's the line that I absolutely cannot allow to be crossed, and how, not only when do I leave, but how do I leave, and setting that plan of where do I go when I leave, and not just storming out and then trying to figure that out later. There's a lot to consider if you have a dysfunctional family. And so go to a therapist, talk all that out beforehand, develop a plan, and have some confidence going in that you can just relax and have a good time, that you can be patient. And if things do go basically okay, enjoy it. Have fun. You don't have to go in defensive because you have a plan of what you're going to do if things go badly. But yes, rehearse it, think about it, talk about it, discuss it with people, even within your family that you can in depth, and make sure everyone in the family knows this is where my boundary is. But talk about that with a therapist. Don't just try to wing it. Don't just try to go into it alone, because this is a very common issue. And every therapist you go to is going to have dealt with this before.
Yeah, and it sounds like having a plan and having already thought through that might reduce our own reactivity
Yep.
and help us provide more thoughtful responses instead. Would you say that that's true?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you think about almost anything in life. We get nervous if it's important to us. If you're a pianist and you have a recital or a concert, you're going to be nervous. But if you're prepared, you're also excited about that, and you can relax and enjoy it. If you're an athlete, yes, you're going to be nervous before the big game, and there's going to be some tension there. But if you're prepared and you're good at what you do, and you have prepared for this game, you can go in and enjoy it and prepare to win. And if we have the same attitude going into our family situation, we're prepared, we've spoken with the counselor, we have a plan, then we know what we're going to do if things go bad. We don't have to be on edge waiting for it to go bad. We can just enjoy it and have a good time and be relaxed. And then if things start to go that way, maybe we can mention, this is going in a direction I'm not comfortable with. And then we have a plan of how we're going to handle things going forward. It helps so much when we're not trying to wing it, when we're just going in defensive, hoping things go well. When we have a detailed plan and we know where we stand on things and what we're going to do if it goes bad, then we can go in relaxed and maybe, hopefully, actually have a good time.
So earlier you mentioned that in some cases it may not even be a good idea for someone to attend that family event. And you used physical violence as one example. Are there other instances that you think people should really consider seriously if they should not attend that family event this year?
Yeah, I mean, especially if there's things towards children, if there is someone in the family that is too touchy with children, we can't expose children to that. And just because it's family members, don't think that there's not sexual perpetrators and predators within families. It does happen. And so those type of things are just those are absolutes. violence and molestation and things of that nature are absolutes. Other things, maybe we compromise, maybe we talk through some things, but there are certain absolutes. Know what those are. And if that has happened in the past, then there's no second chances. People don't get second chances when we find out those type of things are happening. And that can be very difficult to say, I'm just not going. I'm not going to go in with a plan. I'm just not going at all because it's too dangerous. It's dangerous to me or to my children or my family and to my immediate family, perhaps. And so there are lines that we draw that we have to find other family for the holidays. And that's okay. Now, that's going to be a grief process. Let's just recognize that's going to hurt. If we have to say my family is too dysfunctional, too violent, they turn the other way when there is a sexual predator in our midst, and they want to just ignore that, things of that nature, we can't be there. And so we're going to have to be at a place where we start to think about family being more than blood relation. Relationships can be built outside of kinship, and people can develop families of choice. And we can find this in religious groups, and we can find this among friends, and we can find it among coworkers. And while it's not ideal, and while there is a grief process to that, and again, when you're in that kind of situation, please get help. Don't try to do that alone. Get some therapy. Go to a counselor. But I will say again, no counselor is going to be surprised by that. There are plenty of people that have to end relationships. And I write in my book that one of the practical realities of relationships is some of them have to end. If you want healthy relationships in your life, you have to end those that are not in order to make room for those that are. And it is difficult to think about ending a relationship with a family and building a new one of choice among friends or among church members or people around you that you can relate to safely. But while that can be a difficult path, it's worth it in the long run. So get the help you need. Family doesn't have to just be kin. Doesn't have to be blood relation.
Yeah, and that's such an important thing that you shared because there are so many people who have had to make the decision to spend the holiday with their friends that are like family rather
Yes.
than their blood family because it is unsafe. And maybe there are people thinking through that decision this year for the first time. But I think your point that safety comes first for yourself and your children who really don't have a lot of power around who they're exposed to is the adult responsibility, especially during the holidays when we do have a choice about where we spend that. And so, do you have any examples from the Bible of boundaries being used?
Oh, I think Jesus said this all the time. I mean, he said about dusting the sand from our feet. There are times that okay, we tried, but things just can't always work, and it is okay to move on. And even when Jesus said to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Now that didn't end the relationship. In fact, it wasn't much after that. The Bible records Peter going with him to the transfiguration, and so not many verses later, Peter is there with Jesus for one of the greatest moments of all time. But when Peter was going too far, Jesus told him. In Peter's case, to his credit, he was willing to receive that. He was willing to change. And sometimes that can happen. When we set boundaries, it doesn't necessarily mean we're ending a relationship. It can, and we need to be prepared for that. And that is okay if it does. But sometimes that relationship can be amended. It can be changed because we're willing and have the courage to set that boundary. Jesus was never unclear about where he stood. When you have Jesus turning over tables in the temple, Jesus is very clear where he stood on really everything, and yet always showed compassion when people did disagree with him, when people did fight against him, and when people would not accept the truth. He always showed compassion and patience and love, and yet at the same time was willing to set that boundary. One of the greatest, I think, of how this balance works of being patient and kind, but at the same time setting boundaries is what Jesus told the woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and they were going to stone her. And of course, he said, "Without sin, cast the first stone," and everyone left. He said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Now, those are opposites. At first, he's saying, "That's okay. Don't worry about it." But then he's saying, "But worry about it, and you need to change." And he can do both of those perfectly at the same time. And that's why we have such tension sometimes, because we're going to feel more comfortable with one or the other. A lot of people are going to be very comfortable with the compassion, with the "that's okay, I'm not going to condemn you, whatever you did, that's fine." And other people are going to be very comfortable drawing that line and saying, "This has to change." Those are personality issues, and it's not wrong on either side. Jesus, being perfection, was able to hold both in perfect tension at the same time. And that's what we need to try to get as close to that as we can, of saying to people, "It's okay. Well, I know you're going to make mistakes, and that's fine. But this needs to stop. Neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more." That's a very hard balance to strike. Jesus did it perfectly. We need to work toward that, of not being too strict in our boundaries, and yet knowing where the line is and saying, "Don't do this anymore."
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that example about Jesus. He was very clear about where he stood with his boundaries. And so, for those of us who have struggled with that, that's a great thing to work towards. But then I remember reading in a book, and I can't recall which one, but Jesus, neither did he beg people to change. And so he let them be who they were without trying to beg and negotiate and all of that. And so I think we can also learn from that example too. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. When that person who's triangulated comes to you and says, "But that's just who they are." Fine, that's who they are. But I am who I am, and I get to be that too. And that might mean we can't be in the same room, and that's okay. It might mean that I can't be part of this family. That's going to hurt, but it's okay. You can still live a really good life and have really great relationships, and probably better ones, when you end those very dysfunctional, toxic relationships. And so it is that balance of finding that place where we show patience, compassion, understanding, but only to align.
That's so great. And so, do you have any last words to share with listeners or any last suggestions on the topic of boundaries so that they can really begin to have happier holiday season this year?
I think the big thing is to understand you are not alone in this. Sometimes when we have these dysfunctional family situations, it feels like we're the only one, and everyone else is talking about their happy family, and we're the ones struggling. You are not alone in this. It happens way too much. It happens a lot. And so don't be afraid to talk about it, and particularly go to a counselor and talk about it. But don't keep secrets. Secrets are where dysfunction thrives. Secrecy is where toxicity and violence and predatory behavior, all these things thrive in secrecy. And so in the southern United States where I'm from, you can hear my accent. I'm from the South. There's this idea we don't want to air our dirty laundry in public. We don't want to just talk about all our family stuff where people will think bad of us. And that kind of attitude is what keeps these things going. Talk about it, especially with a therapist, and understand you are not alone in this. And when you do talk about it, people are probably going to say, "Yeah, me too."
With that authenticity, you often find community of people who've
Yeah.
experienced the same thing. But I do think that there is a difference between maybe sharing your concerns with a best friend who will keep your confidence and a therapist versus just
Mhm.
sharing with everyone in public, like
Yeah.
a Facebook blast. I'm not going to see my family this year because they're
Right.
toxic. So I think there's a distinction there.
I agree.
Um, yeah. So thank you so much for being with us today. Do you have a favorite scripture to share with us on boundaries before I let you
It's
go?
the one I shared earlier when Jesus said to that woman, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." I love that scripture because it really calls us to that place of perfection, of compassion and boundaries simultaneously.
Great. Perfect. So, how can listeners find out more about your upcoming book, Learning to Love? When will that come out? And how can people get a copy of it?
Yeah, go to my website. It's markahicks.com. The book comes out in 2025 in June, but pre-orders will be available soon. And in the meantime, you can get my free ebook, The 5 Components of Love. I teach the 5 components that anyone can practice in order to build healthy, happy, thriving relationships, even if you do come from a dysfunctional family. Love is a learned skill set. I'm also available for speaking engagements and for workshops and for coaching. And so please be in touch, or you can just email me on my website and let me know you listened today and that you enjoyed the show. I'd love to hear from you.
That's wonderful. And if you want to know more about Learning Love, we did an episode in season 2. So head over to season 2 in the Room to Bloom, and you can find out more on that topic because he's got some wonderful strategies there for you. So thanks again for being with us today. And God bless your new book as it
Thank
comes
you.
out.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right. God bless. Thanks for joining me. I hope this episode has blessed you. If so, please subscribe, comment, and share. It's a great way to spread the love and keep good content rolling. As a reminder, this podcast is purely for informational and educational purposes only. Listening to content is not a replacement for medical or mental health care. Please make decisions with your personal care providers. Stay tuned for next week's episode. But if you want more content or free resources in the meantime, head over to FromBudToBloom.com. See you next time. Until then, live fully free in Christ.